Hello everybody, welcome to the video. Hopefully you're all having amazing creative days. So today we're going to be talking about back button autofocus or rear button autofocus, depending on where you're from. I find people call it by a different name. But yeah, in this video I'm going to talk about that and how to set it up on your Canon camera. And if you don't shoot with Canon, if you're shooting Fuji, Nikon, Sony, something else, all this knowledge can be applied to your camera system as well. Just keep in mind that in your menu, things might be called something slightly different, but more or less, it's all the same thing across all the different brands. So in this video, first thing we're going to talk about is what is back button autofocus. Just a little theory, we're going to touch on that quickly. I'm going to show you how to set up back button autofocus, and then I'm going to show you how to set up dual back button autofocus. So you can have one button for tracking eyes or vehicles or animals, and you can set up the second button to track objects, so object tracking. For example, you're shooting a bride at a wedding and she's holding up her champagne glass and you want to focus on the champagne glass instead of her face. Let's say you're shooting with a 51.2. You want shallow depth of field, so the glass is in focus, she's blurry. If you have eye tracking on, the camera will automatically stick onto the bride's eye and ignore the glass. So you have to use the secondary button to track an object to track the wine glass or champagne glass. So that's kind of cool. And then I'm going to talk about tap to track. And I'm going to contrast rear button or back button autofocus with tap to track. And we'll kind of just talk about which method is better, which method is faster, because there's pros and cons to each one. And yeah, that'll be the video. All right, so first off, let's talk about what is back button autofocus. All right, so let's talk about what is rear button autofocus or back button autofocus. So you have a shutter release button and it's got two levels. When you half press it, the camera will start metering, so it's looking for light and trying to understand the exposure, and it starts autofocusing. So it'll start, if you have it set to eye tracking, it'll look for eyes. If you have it to animal tracking, it looks for animals. And then when you fully press the button, it takes the exposure. But if you set up back button autofocus, you take the autofocus feature off of that front shutter release button and you set it to one of these back buttons, usually the AF on button. So when you push the button halfway, camera will start hunting for exposure. And when you push the AF on button at the back of the camera, camera will start focusing. And then you push the front shutter button all the way down and it takes the photo. So that's the basic gist of back button autofocus. Okay, now let's talk about how to set up back button autofocus. I'm going to be using the R5 Mark II, but this will work with the R5, it'll work with the R6 Mark II, R6, even the EOS R. It'll work with all of Canon's cameras. So the one thing to keep in mind is the R5 Mark II has Canon's newest menu, so it's slightly different from the R5, which has the last gen menu. So things might be slightly different. I'm going to point out what the differences are as I go, but I do have a video right there, boom, boom, all about dual button autofocus setup with the R5. So after you watch this video, go check out that video, because this video is going to be a little more informative and a little more in depth, but that's going to focus more on the menu settings. All right, so with that being said, so let's jump into the menu and I will show you how to set up back button autofocus. So first place you want to go is into the AF tab, and we're going to set AF operation to servo. Now the difference between servo and one shot is if you use rear button autofocus or even the front shutter to autofocus, the camera will focus on the subject, but if the subject moves between the time you half press and fully press, it'll be out of focus. So if you're tracking things that are moving, servo is better for you. And if you're doing still life or portraits of people that aren't moving, you can get away with one shot, but I definitely recommend servo mode. Next, area AF. I keep it on wide. So wide means that the whole area is able to track eyes. So you have like the left eye, right eye of both models here. The whole sensor is tracking eyes. But if we go back to the menu and we set it to, let's say, zone 1, now everything in this square is tracking. Notice how the eyes on the left model's face aren't being tracked. Now I have to bring the zone over. So only things in that autofocus area or zone or box will be tracked. For back button autofocus, I like to keep it on wide. So let's go back to wide, whole area. And now, next up we have whole area tracking servo AF. And you want to turn that on. And that again is telling the camera to use the whole area, its whole field of view to track eyes in. So if you turn that off, you're only going to track in your little box that you set up. But I'd rather the camera track all eyes. I mean, I shoot events, weddings, that kind of thing. So I want all my eyes being tracked. So I turn that on. Next up, we have subject to detect. Obviously, if you shoot people, set it to people, animals, vehicles, that kind of thing. And then here I have my case manual settings pretty much default, except for the fact that I changed my tracking sensitivity to locked on. So I want whatever eye I'm focusing on, I want the camera to lock onto that eye and not drift and not go anywhere else. So definitely set that to locked on. Okay, and let's get out of here. Preview AF. Okay, so this one's important. On the older R5 menu, this is called continuous AF. On the new menu, it's called preview AF. And if you have that enabled, and it's enabled by default, the camera will continuously focus on things even if you're not shooting. So if the camera is hanging by your side, pointing at the ground, or you put the camera down on a table somewhere and it's on, it's going to continuously look for things to autofocus on. And that's fine, but you're going to need a lot of batteries because that feature drains your batteries really fast. So I would recommend turning that off. So disable preview AF. All right, and next you want to go to your green tab if you're shooting with Canon's new menu, or orange tab if you're shooting with the older menu. It doesn't matter which one it is, as long as you find the area where you can customize your buttons and go to customize buttons for shooting. First thing you want to do is change the shutter button, so click on that. And by default, the shutter button, like I said, will start light metering and autofocusing when you half press. So you want to change this to metering start. So it's only going to meter light, it's not going to autofocus. So we turn that on. And then we go down to the AF on button. And by default, it'll be up here somewhere, metering and AF start. You want to change that to AF on detect subjects. So we turn that on. And now, when we hit the AF on button, it starts tracking the eye. Now you use the joystick to flip between eyes, and obviously if there's 5 people, there's going to be 10 eyes. If there's 3 people, there's going to be 6 eyes, provided everyone has 2 eyes. But yeah, that's the basic gist of rear button autofocus. And if we release this, you can see as long as I'm holding the AF on button, it's focusing on the eye. We can switch between the models. Now the one thing to keep in mind is when you don't have the AF on button pressed, you'll notice there's a white box around the model's eye. Don't be fooled by that. That doesn't mean it's focusing, because you have continuous focus off and you're not pressing any autofocus buttons on the camera. So just because you have the box around the eye, it means the camera is tracking the eye, but isn't necessarily focused on the eye until you hit the button and then the box turns blue and now you know you're focused on the eye. So now you know how to set up back button autofocus, one button. Now let me show you how to set up dual back button autofocus. You know what's better than having one rear button autofocus button? Having 2 rear button autofocus buttons. One of the buttons is going to be for tracking eyes, which is what we already learned. And the second button is going to be for spot tracking. So if you want to track one object, for example, instead of an eye, we can switch over to that second button and track an object. So let's jump into the menu again. We're here at Customize Buttons for Shooting. And we're going to set the star button for this. And yeah, here we go, metering and AF start. Click on that. Now the thing is, if we try and use this right now, we're not going to be able to switch. That's the AF on, but we have no way of actually tracking something. So we have a camera down here, but there's no way I can actually track it at the moment. So what we have to do is we have to get out of this wide area autofocus. So we have to go back to the autofocus menu. And then AF area, we have to change to, let's say, zone 1, AF1. So now, if my joystick is on this model, I'm tracking her eyes. And if we go to this model, I'm tracking her eyes. But for example, if I want to track this camera, I move that onto there, or I move the AF zone onto the camera and then hit the star button. And now we are tracking the camera. And then if I want to go back to tracking the face, I have to move the box over to the face and then hit the AF on button, and now I'm tracking the model's face. If I want to switch faces, I have to use the joystick to move the AF on button over. And there we go. And I want to track this object, star button, oops, star button, and there we go. Now we're tracking the object. So basically, you have to use your joystick to point at what you want to track and then hit either the AF on button to track eyes or the star button to track an object. All right, so there you go. Now you know how to set up back button autofocus for single button operation or dual button operation, and you can go have fun shooting all you want. But before you start shooting and you click off this video, I just want to introduce you to tap to track. Because in my personal opinion, I don't really see the point in using back button autofocus anymore. I mean, back in the day when we shot with DSLRs, it was absolutely necessary to use back button autofocus simply because the autofocus of those cameras was different. We didn't have face tracking and eye tracking and animal eye tracking and vehicle tracking with the DSLRs. It was basically you had points on your LCD screen and whatever, or LCD or EVF, no, OVF. That's how old DSLRs were. We had OVFs, and you pick your point, and as long as you have your focus button pushed down, the camera will be focusing on that point. So, for example, if you were to shoot a wedding and the bride is walking towards you down the aisle, and you're hitting the shutter button, you're going click, 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 right? Every time you push the shutter button down, you would engage the autofocus, take the photo, and when you released it, you disengage the autofocus. And then when you pushed it again, you would re-engage the autofocus. And then when you shot the picture, you disengage the autofocus. So if you're going click, 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 you're engaging autofocus, disengaging, engaging, disengaging, engaging, disengaging. So the camera would kind of be a little herky-jerky when it comes to autofocus. And that was a huge drawback, especially when shooting events. So there was two ways to get around that. One, you put on speed shooting or high speed shooting. So when the bride's walking towards you, you're like holding down the button. So it's always focusing and always shooting. Downside to that is you have like 2,000-3,000 images to call through after the wedding. The other option was to set up dual button or rear button autofocus. So as long as you were pushing your AF on button, the camera would be focusing, and you had to keep your spot on your bride. So you hold down the AF on button and you're like click, 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 click. And every shot would be in focus because you're holding the AF on button and the camera is continually focusing, right? But now with modern cameras like mirrorless cameras, they are continuously autofocusing anyway. So do you actually even need back button autofocus? As long as your shutter is pushed down halfway, camera's tracking. Just don't lift your finger fully off the shutter and it'll keep shooting. So, all right, so let's talk about speed here for a second. If you're just shooting people and eyes, back button autofocus is fantastic. But if you're switching between people and objects, it might slow you down. Now, here's the issue I have with rear button autofocus. So I want to focus on the model on the right here. So I'm focusing on her eye, I'm getting the shot, focusing on the eye. But you see, I really don't have much, I can't really switch between left eye, right eye when I have this enabled. See, I'm trying to switch. I'm using the AF on button, I'm using the star button. And it's just kind of like the camera's deciding which eye to focus on. And then if I want to focus here, I got to move the focus area over to focus on this model's face. So my big issue with rear button autofocus is it slows you down because rather than having just the shutter release button and the joystick to worry about, now you got the shutter release, the AF on, and the joystick. So you got to do a little dance with your thumb. So for example, I want to focus on the model on the right. Joystick's got to go to the right, and then I hit the AF on button. If I want to go to the other model, I have to use the joystick and go over. And if you're shooting in a slow-paced environment, not a big deal. But if you're shooting a live event like wedding or sports or something like that, then you're constantly jumping between the AF on button and the joystick, and it gets a little tedious, right? Because you're constantly letting go and reacquiring and stuff like that. Because as long as you're touching the joystick, the camera isn't focusing on anything. So now what we're gonna do is I'm going to turn off dual button. We're gonna go to single button autofocus, or single button back button autofocus, tongue twister. So we're gonna go to the star button and we are just gonna put that over there. And we're gonna go to menu, we're gonna go back to autofocus. And we are going to set this to wide area. So area wide. Okay. So now we have single button autofocus, and it works a lot better for tracking people than dual button simply because I can use the joystick now to cycle between the eyes. I don't have to move that little box around. I can just cycle between the eyes, which is super handy. So this is a lot better. So with single button rear button autofocus, you have more control over which eye the camera focuses on. So we can focus on this eye, this eye, this eye, this eye, and we don't have a box that has to be placed over the model's or subject's head to tell the camera to focus on an eye inside that box. So that's pretty cool. Single button autofocus, but rear button autofocus, in my opinion, works better than dual. However, now we're gonna show you tap to track. So for this, we have to go back to the green menu. Customize buttons. And now for the shutter release, we're gonna set it back to default here. And the thing is, I can't record the back of my screen and talk to you and record the screen at the same time. So I'm gonna have to change this lens and just record the back of the screen, and I'll show you tap to track. All right, so now we're recording the back of the R5 Mark II screen, and I do have rear button autofocus single button enabled, and I also enabled the shutter button. So the shutter button will focus on the eyes. And the reason I did that is I just want to show you that this method works with rear button autofocus or without rear button autofocus. So right now, I can use the joystick to cycle through the eyes. No problem, everything's cool. And then if I'm holding the shutter button down halfway, I can take my photos. And I can also use rear button autofocus. But the thing is, with my thumb on the AF on button, I have to let go of the AF on button to touch the joystick. With the shutter release button, as long as the button is pressed down halfway, I have control. So I can still be focusing and tracking while I'm switching eyes. So that is a huge speed advantage if you need that creative control. Now let me show you tap to track. So rather than using the second button, the start button for tracking, what I can do is just double tap the screen, and you can see, double tap the screen. And as long as you're holding the button down, the shutter button down halfway, it's gonna track the object. So now we're tracking the camera. Hopefully you can see that on the screen, little blue box around there. And I will show you again, tap on the eye, we go back to eye tracking. But if we're using the AF on button for tracking, the rear button, it'll do the same thing. So you can, but it wants to jump to the eye, you see that? So double tracking that, but as soon as the eye pops into frame, now we're tracking the eye. One more time, double tap on the camera using the AF on to rear button autofocus. There's no eye in the frame, but as soon as there is an eye in the frame, it jumps to the eye, right? Whereas with the shutter release button, if I double tap on the camera, hold the shutter release halfway, if there's eye in the frame or not, the camera's still gonna track that other camera in the frame. Even if I leave the frame and come back, I lost it that time, but sometimes, it didn't. Sometimes it catches it when it comes back, but either way, you don't want your subject to leave the frame. So that is the difference between using tap to track and rear button autofocus. All right, so there you go. Now you know how to set up single button rear autofocus, dual button rear autofocus, and you know tap to track. So which method is best? It doesn't matter. I mean, in the end, what is this? This is just a tool, right? You use this to get the photo, the final deliverables that you give to the client. That's the important thing. That's what really matters. This is just a tool. It's a means to an end. So whichever method you want to use to set up your camera to give you the best advantage in the style of photography that you shoot in your environment, that's the best option. So, like I always say, there's no such thing as best in a world of individuals, and how you set up your camera is definitely an individual choice. So yeah, set up your camera however you like. Now you understand the different features and you know the pros and cons between tap to track and single button and dual button, rear button autofocus. So there you go. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of stuff, definitely subscribe to the channel. I do a lot of tips and tricks videos with Canon gear, and I'm starting a whole series on lighting, and I want to take you on some behind the scenes photo shoots so you can learn some studio stuff and studio technique from me as well. And one more thing before I go, I was booted off of Instagram. Someone reported a photo a little while ago, and I refuse to play the Instagram algorithm game and put up shorts and reels and all this stuff. I just post photos. I don't try and sell you anything. So if you want to subscribe to my Instagram and see content I create with these cameras, definitely come check out my Instagram. Would appreciate it. Trying to grow it, but again, since I don't play along with the Instagram algorithm, it's hard to grow. So I'm inviting you to help me out. And yeah, with that being said, this video is over. If you have any questions about the R5 Mark II or back button autofocus, or if I missed something and you want to add something, let me know in the comments down below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.